Day 2 of the symposium was led by the Pacific Risk Management Ohana, or PRIMO, an organization based in Hawaii that brings people together to help Pacific Island communities become more resilient to the impacts of natural hazards. Led with opening remarks by Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio, the keynote address was presented by Kobe Stanton, Director of Readiness from FEMA Region 9. Up next, a panel on disaster recovery, challenges and opportunities. The panel will provide an overview of the role of Guam's Recovery Office and the use of the Recovery Support Function approach.
I'd like to call up our panelists for the panel on disaster recovery. I'm very pleased to have with us David Cruz, who is Guam's Recovery Officer. He is the Director of Recovery in the Office of the Governor, Gov Guam. Also, William Brandon Eidlet, who is a lead meteorologist. Brandon is a lead meteorologist with NOAA's National Weather Service Weather Forecast Office in Guam. He maintains close relationships with partner weather service offices throughout Micronesia and local government. All right. We also have with us Robert Pesapane. He is the FEMA Region 9 Recovery Division Director and Deputy Federal Coordinating Officer for COVID-19 operations. In that role, as the Director of Recovery, he supervises implementation of FEMA's public and individual assistance programs. And finally, Catherine Katie Lipiecki is the FEMA Region 9 Mitigation Division Director. She oversees the regional implementation of mitigation programs. And prior to joining FEMA Region 9, she was actually engaged in the Puerto Rico recovery effort. And so I'm sure she has a lot of great lessons learned. Please give them all a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Testing. Okay, I guess I'm up in the batter's box. Good morning. Close to good afternoon for all of you. And I really can't see everybody because that light is super bright. But we got a great screen here. Okay, I'm David Cruz, Recovery Officer. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is our role in the Recovery Office. You know, how we kind of chose that recovery support plan function that you all are going to be engaged in this afternoon with the breakout sessions. And why we chose that structure, how it works for us, and kind of sum it all up. Pretty quick and dirty, and you'll find out a lot of my talking points are really being covered by Kobe and Michelle with the different funding pots. Okay, role of the Recovery Office, as you can see, our charter really was Executive Order 2020-13 to establish the Pandemic Recovery Office, so our job is just to execute the Governor's EO and kind of marshal in the resources, provide the leadership for that, for all the recovery support function. We kept it simple, and FEMA was there every step of the way, you know, to guide me. It was a steep learning curve in the very beginning. Lots of reading materials, lots of meetings. I think the biggest challenge is trying to get everybody together, all the stakeholders, you know, right in the middle of the pandemic, especially the frontliners, people from public health. And Gita was, of course, was busy engaging in recovery plans and in the different economic working groups. And the other things that we also do that's really important is managing public assistance. And I've got three of my folks in the back that are kind of listening in this. We do all the quarterly reports to FEMA, kind of like the boots on the ground here. We submit everything up to FEMA, you know, for approval, and then we close out the disasters. We do that for COVID, and we're still working on legacy disasters. Typhoons Wu Tip, Mangut, Dolphin, and that stuff goes back to like 2014. It's about $14 million in legacy disasters. We're up to about 38 project worksheets. Almost $37 million have been approved and obligated right now. Okay, next slide. Okay, recovery support function model, we chose that. We looked at a lot of different plans. We even looked at the CNML plan. We figured, hey, what, one island to another, okay? Maybe that works for us. But everybody had different plans. We wanted one that kind of fit our role here. And the reason why we went with the recovery support function plans is that, well, why not? I mean, FEMA was kind of set up in their recovery division with those different 6 models that was already set up, and they really had the expertise. Funding was not a problem. It was, as Michelle mentioned, lots of pots coming down, but we really needed their expertise. God, they got a lot of smart folks at FEMA, and I just want to thank Bob. Your folks have been superb in all the support and providing all the technical assistance. And we also wanted to work just on 2 recovery support functions, you know, to align with the governor's executive order, which was, of course, the economy and public health stuff that was impacted most by the pandemic. Okay, at the same time, we want to give the commander-in-chief, the governor, you know, a tool that's flexible and scalable. And as Kobe mentioned, this stuff you can scale up or scale down. And that's a great resource for the governor, you know, to pull out. And the only piece we're missing is we don't have any plans written. So we're going to do that this afternoon, and next week, hopefully write those plans. And at the same time, this is a whole community approach, and it allows collaboration from all the stakeholders. Okay, next slide. It also allows us to achieve all our goals. Those are our biggest thing is to allow the governor to incorporate all her objectives and goals, especially the medical complex and the private partnerships involved in building that complex, and as well as that enhanced public health system, because, you know, as you know, the lab burned down. They need money for that. So lots of challenges, but a lot more opportunities involved. Okay, next slide. And finally, this is kind of how we're set up. This is still work in progress. What you see in the white is what we have now. Like I said, economic and public health are the only 2 we stood up. But we need to kind of take this to the next level. Hopefully, with all your help here, all the stakeholders, we can get the plans written. We need an overall Guam comprehensive recovery plan. And we also need individual plans in each of these support functions. And hopefully, we can hammer all that out in next week. Okay, next slide. The governor also decided to establish task forces and working groups. As you can see, there's an economic diversification working group that he is chairing, tourism recovery task force from GVB, and we need the economic recovery plan to be written. Finally, my last slide, public health. You can see the Medical and Public Health Services Action Task Force is charged with planning for the construction of that medical complex. And the governor has lots of advisors. Guam National Guard State Surgeon Cell is one of them. She also has a physician advisory group. And we need to write the public health recovery plan. Okay, so in summary, this is probably the best time. The stars are aligned. We've got great leadership from the governor and lieutenant governor. The governor is a former nurse, or still is, I think. She still holds her certification. Got a great background in public health. And you heard the lieutenant governor here today. What an amazing background and experience that he's got. Really, this is probably the best combination of leadership I've seen in a long time. Educated, great background, and they're making things happen. Leadership is often defined in a crisis, so this is the time to move forward, give them a plan with lots of options, and we can make things happen in Guam. We'll recover pretty quickly. I see it happening all over the place now. It's an unusual pandemic, as some of our speakers have brought up. The only time where you have a disaster where you're still responding and recovering at the same time. Most disasters, you know, like the typhoon, they come and go within a day or two. Then you start recovering after that. Response is only a short period, but recovery takes a long time. But we're still responding and recovering at the same time. So that's it. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I am William Eidlet with the National Weather Service. I am one of the lead forecasters, and today we're going to be here to get a briefing on Super Typhoon Not Real as it's approaching Guam. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this super typhoon is just to the southeast of Guam. It continues to head toward us at about 10 miles per hour, and so this is the latest forecast track. Right now, Super Typhoon Not Real has maximum sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, and we are expecting to see this continuing curve toward Guam within the next 24 hours. As you can see, Guam remains right in the crosshairs of this powerful super typhoon, and we expect no change except for maybe perhaps a little bit more strengthening of this typhoon as it comes toward the Marianas. So, for our current watches and warnings and advisories, we currently do have a typhoon warning in effect for Guam. We expect to see damaging winds of 39 miles per hour or more within the next 24 hours around sunrise tomorrow, with typhoon conditions expected early afternoon tomorrow. We do expect in this situation to see catastrophic typhoon winds equivalent to a Category 4 or 5 typhoon tomorrow evening. Additionally, we do have a flash flood warning. We are expecting excessive and torrential rainfall exceeding 15 to 20 inches through tomorrow night. This will cause extensive flooding within the streams and rivers, and especially with significant debris flow in the drainage outlets. Additionally, we do expect to see open ocean sea conditions exceeding 30 to 40 feet near the center of the super typhoon, and along with surf and inundation hazards, we could be seeing surf up to 30 feet tomorrow afternoon, with inundation up to 15 feet along windward-facing shores. This will be highest along narrow reefs and southeastern shores, especially, and then for western shores later. One thing I want to keep in mind, in this situation, we could be seeing the eye of the super typhoon come right over Guam. And if that is the case, everybody needs to keep in mind that those winds and rains will quickly subside. But that is not the end of the storm. The extreme winds and torrential rains will very rapidly resume as the backside of the eye comes across. Anybody that is caught outside of the shelter will be extreme risk of injury or death due to flying debris. Again, with the eye of the storm possibly coming over Guam, we need to make sure this information is shared and understood widely by everybody. This is not something we should be caught off guard with. People responding to emergencies during the storm should very carefully weigh the risk of venturing out to respond to the emergencies. So, what kind of damage could we be seeing with these wind impacts? We ask that you plan for extreme winds of major typhoon force. Many well-built wooden or tin homes will be damaged or destroyed. Extensive or total destruction of non-concrete industrial buildings. Additionally, we're looking at buildings made of light materials will be completely destroyed, and even buildings, concrete buildings with non-concrete roofs will see extensive damage. Many of the primary power lines and most secondary power lines will be downed. And finally, severe damage to some concrete poles is expected in these conditions, and we could see some failure of well-constructed typhoon shutters. So we ask that people remember not to be near the windows, even with typhoon shutters. Final thoughts: this typhoon could become the new benchmark for future typhoon comparisons for Guam. This could be exceeding Pamela and Karen. While we could hope for a slight bobble in the overall storm track, we cannot plan on hope, but we must prepare for the worst-case scenario. Right now, we are in the final 24 hours to prepare houses and businesses and to get people into hardened shelters. But ultimately, every residential structure that is not fully concrete should be considered at risk. Now, that is a sample of a heavy weather brief that could very possibly happen here on Guam. This is similar to what we were dealing with Super Typhoon Wu Tip for Saipan. Here's some pictures from Saipan after Super Typhoon Wu Tip. Guam has been fortunate not to have dealt with such disaster in quite a few years. So let's look at a little bit of tropical cyclone climatology. This is all tropical cyclones between 1945 and last year. Tropical depression, tropical storm, and typhoons. And the biggest thing to notice is as you head into the wet season months, July, August, September, October, we see that rise in tropical cyclones affecting Guam or coming near Guam. However, as we take a closer look at typhoons and tropical storms, now we're getting a little bit stronger. Typhoons and tropical storms, we start seeing a little bit of a change in the trend. September, October, November, tends to be the busier months for those slightly stronger storms. And definitely note the blue lines, the blue bars. That indicates a direct hit when storms are within 60 miles of Guam. So how about typhoons? Those are the storms 74 miles per hour and greater. So now we start seeing those numbers, that trend kind of really peak out at October and November, where Guam becomes more susceptible. And then finally, the major typhoons. These are the significant disasters that we should be well ready to respond to. In the top right corner, you see that what kind of periodicity do we have for these major typhoons? Roughly, we could see one every 5 years. How long has it been since we've had a major typhoon strike Guam? It's been a while. So what if this scenario was the one we were facing earlier this week? We got lucky this week. There was a point when Tropical Depression 16 was just north of the Marshall Islands. Computer model guidance was indicating the potential for a strong tropical storm. During one of the briefings, the lieutenant governor expressed some concern. What if there's a chance this system could quickly intensify to the east of Guam? We've certainly seen storms in the past do that. That was a concern. So what if this was the scenario this past week? Would we be able to plan, prepare, and respond quickly and adequately to meet the needs of the island? Are we ready to face such disaster? When was the last time we dealt with such a direct hit? It's been probably about 18 to 20 years. It's before I came out to Guam in 2010. We've had some smaller storms, but nothing significant. And finally, are we due for another super typhoon based on that periodicity of one every 5 years? How close have we been to such destruction? Has there been no significant risk, or have we just been lucky? So let's look at some storms in the past 10 years. 2013, we had Typhoon Francisco. This was a storm that came in from the southeast of Guam. It kind of did a little bobble southwest of Guam. While intensifying, we had about 36 hours of near tropical storm force winds. 36 hours, a lot of rain, a lot of wind. And then that storm quickly intensified to 125 miles per hour just west of Guam. How about 2014's Typhoon Wu? That one passed to the southwest of Guam. It was quickly intensifying, became a 130 mile per hour typhoon just west of Guam about 36 to 48 hours after it made CPA, closest point of approach to Guam. How about Typhoon Halong? That was in July of 2014. We saw the kind of bobbling between categories: tropical depression, tropical storm, strong tropical storm, weak tropical storm. Almost like Tropical Depression 16. It was bobbling between a depression, tropical storm, depression, tropical storm. It's a little bit confusing to the messaging unless you listen to the actual trends that we were expecting a flatlining storm that was expected to eventually intensify. This was the case that we were partly considering for Tropical Depression 16. How long after it passed to the west, it eventually blossomed into a massive typhoon. 2015's Typhoon Masak. That one passed across parts of Micronesia. It quickly developed over just south of Guam, and we had a 145 mile per hour massive typhoon that affected Ulithi and Feist down in Yap State. And just a slight change in direction would have brought that over us. A lot of people here, a lot of long-termers will remember a typhoon. To get to Guam, you've got to come by truck. I've heard that a long time ago. That was the name that a lot of people knew Chuk State as. And there's a reason for that. A lot of storms, when they come through Pohnpei Chuk States, the storms eventually turn to the west-northwest, and Guam is in the crosshairs. How about 2015's Typhoon Dolphin? Look at that track. The blue line is the track that the storm eventually took. The dotted line, that was the forecast at the time that it was north of Pohnpei. So we were at that time expecting a 125 to 130 mile per hour typhoon directly impacting Guam. As it was, the storm tracked a little bit north. The intensification was a little slower, and it passed between Guam and Rota as a quickly intensifying storm. So even as the storm was moving away from us, our winds were increasing because Dolphin was intensifying. It was a massive and powerful typhoon just west of Guam. This is what actually happened. Once it got to the west of Guam, each of those little red dots, that is a 6-hour separation in time. So roughly 24 to 30 hours after it passed, we had a 150-mile-per-hour super typhoon just west of Guam. How about Typhoon Pseudolore later in 2015? This was expected to be a minimal typhoon, about a 75-mile-per-hour storm expected to pass near Tinian, Saipan. It developed a very small nucleus of powerful winds. This passed over Saipan as a very small Category 3 to 4 typhoon, eventually peaking at 180 miles per hour west of the Marianas. We had 2015 Typhoon Goni that was also intensifying as it passed through the Marianas and was a 130 mile per hour storm to the west. Going a little bit later, 2015, again, that was an El Nino year, extremely busy, and El Nino years bring a significant increase in risk of tropical cyclones to the Marianas. 2015 Typhoon Infa, look at that curve. Oh, could we go back one more? Look at the curve. It passed through Chuk State, and usually that puts it in the crosshairs. But fortunately, when it passed, you see those red squares, it started curving more to the west-northwest instead of coming straight at Guam. Close call for us. 130 miles per hour, just southwest of us. Typhoon Maria passed over Guam around July 4th as a tropical storm. We did see some 110 mile per hour damage up on Anderson, Retidian area, and then it was continuing to intensify to the northwest of Guam. It was 125 miles per hour merely 30 hours after passage. 2018's Typhoon Mangkhut, again, the dotted line at the bottom, that was the forecast path. We were expecting to see a 130 mile per hour storm directly hitting Guam again. That was only 72 hours out, a 3-day forecast for 130 miles per hour. What eventually happened, it took a slightly northward jog and then slammed right into Rota. Super Typhoon Wu Tip, 165 miles per hour just before Saipan. Don't need to say anything more, but look at that track to the south, down to the lower right. That was aiming toward Guam, and then it bobbed a little bit north. Typhoon Wu Tip, February 2019, a rare super typhoon for February. We had 10 inches of rain in South Guam, significantly less rain over North Guam, and decreasing even further over the CNMI. That was a massive typhoon just southwest of us. That was a close call. And then 2019 Super Typhoon Hagibis. Look at that curve far to the right. The blue dots, it was aiming right toward Guam, and then it kind of bobbed to the west-northwest and went over the far northern islands of Anatahan, and while it was intensifying. So what if these storms hit Guam? 13 major storms in only 8 years. How does that relate to our climatology? One thing I want you to remember is the difference between business as usual and disaster has only been a matter of hours or a small change in direction. So finally, it's not if, but when.
Can always count on the Weather Service to keep me up at night. Thank you. I won't be sleeping before I leave Guam tomorrow. Another question of if but when. I do believe that, and unfortunately the CNMI has experienced a number of these storms, and I'll be highlighting the effects of Super Typhoon Wu Tip in my presentation today. Lake Colby deployed here from Mangkhut, and we thought it was going to have a devastating impact to Guam. Fortunately, that affected Rota. And then we had Super Typhoon Wu Tip that really devastated Saipan and Tinian. So I'm going to highlight that, try to link that to the National Disaster Recovery Framework, and then prepare for Katie's brief on mitigation and what you can do to prepare before these events occur. Next slide. Again, I'm going to talk about Super Typhoon Wu Tip, the current recovery efforts in the CNMI, and then talk about next steps related to Michelle's briefing, who did an amazing job, by the way, and definitely a valued member of our team in the region. So thank you, Michelle. And she'll, again, to highlight that she'll be here in Guam through mid next week. Next slide. A little bit about FEMA Region 9. We are a very large geographic region. As you can see here in the slide, we cover all of California, Nevada, Arizona, and the entire Pacific. We also have over 150 federally recognized tribal nations, and through the compact and the operational blueprint, we do support FSM and RMI through USAID. Next slide. Next slide. So just as the Weather Service highlighted, U2 was a super typhoon. We, of course, saw the storm track, deployed our incident management assistance teams. We arrived just before the storm impacted the CNMI. It was a devastating storm, and this slide doesn't do it justice, so what I did was I had a video made on our permanent housing construction mission. You're the first large group to see this video. I highlighted the video for the CNMI governor, lieutenant governor, last Tuesday while I was in Saipan, so I will now play a video of the effects of Super Typhoon U2 and then really focus on and I'll have a few slides on our permanent housing construction mission. So we were building new homes as well as repairing permanent construction. So if you can play the video.
It's like 100 something already, very strong. Very like woo, like that, like ghosts or something, like it's flying. There's something that it's flying already. I don't prepare before because I didn't know that it's gonna be that strong.
Typhoon U2 passed through the Northern Mariana Islands this morning, leaving a path of destruction behind.
U2, the strongest typhoon to ever hit the area, passed over the Northern Mariana Islands with wind gusts of over 160 miles per hour, equivalent to a Category 5 hurricane.
I tell you, I kind of knew that this was going to be big. I didn't know it was going to be that big. I've been through a lot of super typhoons in my life, but I was never that scared. I was scared. I knew it was going to devastate the island.
It was total disaster.
Complete chaos. Yeah. The experience was just too terrifying. They literally see fire, thunder, lightning, and everything at each given point. Yeah. Any structure you see standing, there's no windows, no doors to it. Either the roof is missing or a portion of the structure is missing. So.
There's some sight to behold, really, in terms of the devastation. It's quite a sight.
And it was really hurtful because these are families that you know growing up. And during typhoon, the only thing you can do is warn them and let them know that typhoons are serious. And it was really hard to see all those homes blown away.
The reason why we activated the Permanent Housing Construction Mission PHC program and the CNMI is we did an analysis and we looked at the devastation that Super Typhoon U2 presented, the number of homes destroyed, the lack of potential materials on island, as well as labor force to effectuate those repairs. And we were able to look at all the data and get a permanent housing construction mission authorized, which would help expedite the recovery effort for those survivors who need a permanent repair to their home, or in the event their home was completely destroyed, a new construction home.
We will have other super typhoons. That's a given, and the opportunities for these families to not just have a safe home, but a really nice homes is an opportunity that we couldn't pass over.
The standards that they use for the building code, very impressive. I don't want any typhoon to come, but if it comes, I'm sure that these homes will be the one standing. This program is designed to build homes for families so that they don't experience what they experience during typhoons. And these homes are not for 5 years, not for 10 years, not for 15 years. I mean, it is built the right way.
These homes are fully concrete, hardened structures that also have typhoon shutters and doors. So in the next event that we're confident these homes will weather the next storm and really be home for the generations of family in the Sinamai.
Yeah, she told me that she would love to let the people know that waiting, the waiting period, regardless of how long it is, the payoff is just tremendous.
I want to get a house because they can do it one time for me, and then if I get them on and not enough,
right,
I have nowhere to go.
In between.
Yeah.
So having this program, having the folks utilize this program and sticking to it, it is the best decision they can ever make to secure their family in terms of homes.
I don't need to go anywhere. If there's a storm or typhoon, I'm safe. And I can save also whoever needs to be. My sister's house is concrete on the side, but tin on the top. So I said, hey, if there's a storm, can I come to your house? I said, yes, of course, you're welcome.
It's very high value. This is exactly the type of program that have been lacking for a long time.
Anytime that you have this program that's secured for families, that's one less that the government has to worry about safety, and one less for that family to worry about their safety.
The PAC program is a very substantially significant valuation for us, for our community.
I am forever grateful and thankful for everyone that they took their time to build this wonderful home for ours. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very thankful for FEMA.
Yeah,
The governor and
FEMA.
everybody else involved in this project here.
And I thank FEMA so much with the bottom of my heart, and to Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and to all those people that are involved for everything.
I just want to say thank you very much to FEMA and PHC people, the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Seen this video now 3 times and I get a little choked up, I'm not gonna lie. I haven't been involved with this mission since the start, 3 years now, and we're still building homes in the Sinamai. I have a slide on that later. Thank you. Next slide. So the mission, when Super Typhoon Wu Tip happened, we had 3 lines of effort: life-saving, life-sustaining, and recovery management. And I'll kind of touch on the recovery management because, and I'll have another slide here, I think as a community of practice, we do the life-saving, life-sustaining pretty well. And we train for that, we exercise for that, we have a lot of tactical plans for that. Where as a community practice, we need to be improving, and I think a forum like Primo and what you're gonna do this afternoon and the recovery support functions is the recovery management. How are we gonna deal with housing? How are we gonna deal with debris? How are we gonna deal with the economic impacts? These are the things where we don't have tactical plans, we don't have concepts of operations, and I think discussions like this and this afternoon will help build those out. Next slide. You've seen a similar slide in Michelle's briefing on the pandemic, which has a very long continuum, and we don't know where the pandemic's going. But out of the National Disaster Recovery Framework, as mentioned, in the short term, days to weeks, we stabilize the incident. We bring food, we bring water, we work with community, and I think we do that quite well, especially here in the Marianas. When you get a storm like Super Typhoon Wu Tip, the recovery is years. And we're still building homes, we're still working on reimbursements, and we're still repairing infrastructure. I think what's going to be really powerful in the next presentation with Katie is what we do in the preparedness phase, what we do in the mitigation phase to maximize funding to prevent the infrastructure to be damaged, because when it happens, and if we can't mitigate, it does take years to repair, and we want to get to shorter recovery outcomes. We don't want to take 4 or 5 years. We want to reduce the impact as much as we can beforehand. Next slide. So the power, a key element to stabilize lifelines, had a devastating impact in the CNMI. 2,244 wooden poles were destroyed. Not easy to replace, especially there's not poles just laying around to be easily put up. So FEMA had to work to bring in, identify vendors to bring in power poles. Also, we didn't want to replace wood power poles to have them break again. And so we looked to, under FEMA public assistance, we call it 406 mitigation. We wanted to work and provide for every wooden pole that was destroyed, we made sure that we tried to put it in concrete power poles. So when the next storm happened, we would reduce the impacts to the power system. So again, the storm hit in October timeframe. Power wasn't restored until February, end of February. Same thing with the water supply, was also offline. We're working on a number of mitigation projects to put generators on water wells. The idea is from a FEMA perspective, we don't want to be flying water here when we can fly something else that's critical, so we can build in resiliency, have a hardened water infrastructure that stays online or comes back online very quickly after the storm. That's in everybody's best interest. And the water was restored in December, so a couple months later after the storm made landfall. Next slide. School system, something I'm actively still working on, working with PSS and the CNMI. A lot of the schools were damaged in the CNMI, unfortunately. Here's a depiction of Colbert Elementary School. I'm sure many of you have probably flown into Saipan. You could see these tents from the air. I saw them when I flew in again on Sunday. We built temporary classrooms. I also want to thank the Corps of Engineers, who we mission assigned, and they used their contract authority to actually harden these structures in the sense that they're bolted to the ground. There's concrete footings. FEMA worked, and we provided and contracted for the tents, and these are the temporary classrooms that are still there as we navigate through getting schools rebuilt in the CNMI. Additionally, Northern Marianas College also has these similar tent structures, and they were 60% damaged and destroyed. Next slide. Debris management, something that we've focused on, I think, in previous engagements here on Guam on a debris management plan. I also think it links to the conversation yesterday, talking about recycling, talking about smart solutions. How can we build that into the Guam disaster debris plan now? You see the totals here of green waste and hazardous materials and mixed waste. That's going to go right into the Guam landfill, or have to find ways to ship off Guam. But what can be done now to build in recycling or smart growth to reduce the impact on the Guam landfill when this disaster happens? So I think there's a direct linkage to the conversations yesterday, what can be done now in the pre-planning for debris management. FEMA had to work and bring in trench and air curtain burners to the landfill to reduce the green waste. And so we brought in a couple different modes, but there's pros and cons to that. Environmental impact, environmental clearance and permits needed to do that kind of reduction. Also want to thank the Guam National Guard, who deployed to Guam to do a lot of the debris clearance. I don't think CNMI could have quickly recovered without the support of Guam, the Guam National Guard, who spent many months out there assisting the CNMI government to remove some of this debris. Next slide. Temporary housing and sheltering. And so part of our strategy going into this was, in the video you saw, was the permanent housing construction. So we're physically building new homes and doing permanent repairs. But we knew that was going to take quite a while, and we're still doing it. So what can we do in the interim to provide immediate sheltering relief to survivors from YouTube? We came up with a program. Actually, we started in small scale after Manka on Rhoda and expanded that in YouTube, and we called it the Temporary Emergency Tent and Roofing Installation Program, TETRIS, because everything FEMA does has to have an acronym eventually associated to it. In our distribution center, both in Guam and Hawaii, we do store military-grade Selena tents. And we used every single tent we had to deploy to YouTube. We deployed over 1,800 16 by 16 tents with the help, again, of CNMI government and Guam National Guard. They set up those tents as an interim measure to get survivors to shelter in place at their home of residence so they can get out of the congregate sheltering situation. We also, on the homes that were not completely destroyed, a lot of the tin roofing, we were able to get authorized a temporary roof mission. We literally sourced pretty much all the tin roofing you could get in this country and shipped it to the CNMI. Some of that material is still there to this day. I just saw it when I was there a few days ago, and we're working to dispose of that. But working with the Department of Defense, again, the Guam National Guard and the engineering units, we were able to do 500 temporary roof repairs, both on Tinian and Saipan. And then through our authorities, we activate the voluntary agencies leading and organizing repairs called VALOR. And so we can pay for volunteers to travel from anywhere in the country at this time in the CNMI to do coordinated repairs. And they did a lot of the repairs that we could not do under the roofing mission. So they also did some roofing, they also did some plumbing, they did some electrical, they installed windows and doors to try to make the home habitable and safe for survivors. And that was a really successful mission, and the volunteer organizations that we brought in did an amazing job. And I have many more photos, but these are just some of the highlights there. Next slide. Permanent home construction mission, which was highlighted in the video. We're projected to do 178 new homes, and we did projected to do 110 home repairs. It's actually, I think, 29 homes completed because the first Tinian fully concrete one-bedroom home was done on Sunday. I was there on Tinian to return that home to the survivor. The survivor literally had their truck packed up and was going to move in right when we gave them the keys, and that was right when the next storm was passing through, so it was good timing there. So we have our teams on the ground. For the permanent home construction, we did a lot of town halls to educate the survivors on their options, and once this was authorized, survivors had an option. They could have, if they were eligible, elect to have FEMA build them or repair their home, or through our individual households program called IHP, Individual Assistance, get a grant. And so some survivors chose to do repairs on their own, which was their choice. Some elected to have FEMA do the repairs. The reason why we authorized permanent housing construction because of the devastation is we knew there was going to be a lack of materials on island and a lack of the labor force to do those repairs. And so we had the mission authorized, and a number of these survivors elected to join the permanent housing construction program. We also knew through our program that there was some challenges in order to get homes built, and a lot of that is land use and how properties are passed down through families. We worked an innovative solution called Enhanced Disaster Legal Services through the CNMI Attorney General's Office, where we actually gave them a grant to help survivors go through the court probate, go through the legal process to show home ownership, which is one of the things that FEMA needs in order to build a new home or repair a home. And so that has been successful, and that's still ongoing. And then, of course, we wanted to design homes that were going to stand the test of time. And so working with the CNMI government, these homes were built to the 2018 building code standards, both for high wind and seismic conditions. So they're fully concrete roof. We also wanted to build in some mitigation activity items. And here, and I don't have a really good picture of it, but there's a water catchment system. So the roof is pitched. And at the end, there's a large gallon tank, and so if the power goes out or the water is disconnected, there's a backup water supply. Every home has that, a new home construction. And also, we wired the home for external generators, so there's The whole home is wired to be on external generator connections, so if the survivor has a generator, it could quickly roll up and restore power to the home. So those are additional elements. I also want to thank the Corps of Engineers who actually designed our 1, 2, and 3 bedroom homes and are continuing to be mobilized to help FEMA work with our contractors to build these homes. So again, special thanks to the Corps of Engineers who helped design these homes. Next slide. In terms of where the CNMI is in the recovery process, much like Mr. Cruz presented where Guam is for the pandemic, it's a little more challenging in the CNMI because not only have to deal with the pandemic, but they have to continue to work through the U2 recovery. And so recently the governor developed the infrastructure recovery program called the IRP, where I think CNMI agencies that are tasked to rebuild infrastructure, again, they're challenged with having the right architects, the right engineering, and the right contract support to do those projects. So now the government has kind of consolidated that under the infrastructure recovery program, and they're hiring up additional engineers and that support to help governmental agencies like the school, like the Power Authority, to get their projects complete. It'll also help mitigation, as well as they'll need engineering support. And so they're providing and trying to track all the federal dollars that are coming into the CNMI and make best use of it and make sure that those applicants who have access to those monies have the right expertise to get their projects done. Next slide. The other thing that we worked in partnership with Mitigation is building updated building codes and standards, and we came up with 3 different documents that are going to be soon released and also available to Guam. Code standards and permitting, performance of 1 and 2 family dwellings, and performance of public buildings and critical facilities in the aftermath of disaster. In these documents will contain best practices to enhance building codes and permitting, so we have a more resilient CNMI and hopefully with use of these documents, a more resilient Guam. Next slide. So I think going into the afternoon and further discussions, recovery is a process, and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. And you saw on the continuum, a lot of those decisions need to be made now, and they need to be made in the immediate aftermath of the event in order to shorten that recovery timeline. Because you don't want to be years later trying to figure out how to utilize all the federal funding that's going to come in when the event happens. You want to have a framework and a plan, and you want to have those relationships in place. Critically important in order to shorten the timeline. And again, you want to maximize those efficiencies, minimize delays, and certainly you don't want to duplicate efforts. Next slide. I think this timeline of key federal funding programs is supposed to be difficult to read because that's how difficult recovery is. Here's just a depiction of some of the federal key funding programs that come online at different times. I think what this highlights is when you have an event, some programs come available right away. Some programs require legislative action to turn on that funding. And the unfortunate thing is that it takes really talented individuals who understand the process to link all these federal funds together to drive towards recovery outcomes. And I think one of the things that we're working on right now in the CNMI, and it was one of my focuses, is on the schools being rebuilt and how to use the HUD money for flexible match to match public assistance projects. So if you don't know anything about FEMA Public Assistance traditionally is a reimbursable grant program at 75-25 cost share. And what you can use HUD, CDBG-DR funds, you can match the cost share, but that takes a little bit of work to be able to do that. And right now we're trying to work that through the public school component so they can have 100% federally funded projects to move those schools projects forward. The issue is when that money becomes available, you can see almost a year into the disaster where our money could be obligated very quickly. It takes some time to make that happen, and that's why you need really a recovery office to help navigate you through that. Next slide. And again, how do you build capacity? It's not just emergency management and Homeland Security, although they're a critical player in that, but it's the disaster recovery staff who are trained and understand the process. It's our FEMA team who's here to support community planning and capacity, and it's other federal agencies, certainly, who have expertise, and other state and territorial departments that have to come and be part of the team to make this happen. It can't just be emergency management coming up with the plans, trying to make everything happen. It takes real, true partnership, collaboration, input from other state agencies, territorial agencies, and other federal government agencies who have roles and responsibilities, especially when it pertains to their authority or their funding. And I think that's my last slide. Again, really happy to be here back in Guam. I was here in June. I'll be here for the rest of the day, and look forward to this afternoon's discussion. And with that, I'll turn over to Kitty Lepiecki, our Regional Recovery Division. That's my job, Regional Mitigation Division Director.
All right, great. Thank you, Robert. So earlier in the panel, we saw the tracks of the storms and the near misses here in Guam. And then in the video that Robert shared, we saw what happens with an impact. What I'm trying to do and what the mitigation programs are here to do is to try and prevent some of those damages from happening to begin with. So this morning, I'm going to speak to the role of hazard mitigation planning in the disaster recovery process and how hazard mitigation is key to building more disaster resilient communities. Next slide, please. So to that, I'll be covering a few different topics. So some of us, I think, have a pretty good solid understanding of the planning principles and processes. But for those of you that maybe don't know as much about the FEMA's hazard mitigation plan and the process, I'll be talking a little bit about that. I'll share an approach that the CNMI took to support their recovery efforts through the development of a guide to enable the incorporation of smart growth principles into all aspects of recovery and in new development. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the importance of implementing the plans that we create, and then specifically some grant resources that we can link to those plans and help to achieve these mitigation priorities that are set out in the plans. Next slide, please. All right, so before we dive into some of the different topics of this presentation, though, I thought there would be some value in briefly discussing hazard mitigation in general, just to make sure we have some common terminology. So the textbook definition of mitigation is any sustainable action that reduces or eliminates long-term risk. It's intended to eliminate risk and impact to people, to property, to protect them from future disasters. The key term here is sustainable action. Hazard mitigation is the only phase of emergency management that is specifically dedicated to breaking the cycle of disaster, damage, reconstruction, repair, and repeat. It includes long-term solutions that, when implemented, will hopefully reduce the impacts of disasters in the future. Next slide, please. So I think it's useful to think about mitigation in three broad categories: knowing your risk, reducing that risk, and then buying down the remaining risk that we could not reduce. So know your risk really refers to getting an understanding of the situation by conducting risk assessments, hazard identification, and mapping. So components of the hazard mitigation plan would fall into this category, as would the mapping of flood hazards that we do through FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs. So reducing your risk refers to actions that are taken to manage that risk that we have just identified through our identification and our mapping processes. So for instance, once we identify flood hazards on that flood hazard rate map, all participating communities who participate in the National Flood Insurance Program then take that map and they adopt it, and they associate regulations with the areas in the area of high risk, so that we are building more resiliently in these areas that we've identified. Reducing risk is also done through the adoption of building code, land use regulations, and then taking other mitigation actions through grant funding to implement some changes to reduce that risk. And then finally, we have insuring your risk, which is about buying down that remaining risk, as we mentioned. This can be done through acquiring flood insurance or even other types of hazard insurance. And I'm not going to get into the details of flood insurance or insurance in general in this presentation, but I do want to highlight that having insurance is one of the key tools. It's possibly the best tool that we can have in our toolbox to becoming more whole after a disaster. FEMA programs, other federal programs, state programs, territory programs only go so far. Insurance is really that key. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we have some common definitions of mitigation and how they relate to programs maybe you're familiar with, hopefully you've heard of, I'm going to spend a little time now focusing on hazard mitigation plans. So the purpose of a hazard mitigation plan is to identify, assess, and then reduce long-term risk to life and property from natural hazards. At their core, really, these plans are blueprints for risk reduction at the state, territory, local, tribal levels, and they have a great opportunity to strategically focus on what natural hazards or risks are in your area of planning, what you face, and then how you can identify solutions to becoming more resilient. So to incentivize the planning process, the Stafford Act was amended in 2000 to include the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. This act requires that an adopted and FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan is in place in order for a jurisdiction to receive funding through the grant programs. And there are several grant programs. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which maybe you're familiar with, Flood Mitigation Assistance Act, and then even the new BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. Additionally, a state or territory hazard mitigation plan is required for public assistance, permanent work, and even the fire management assistance grants. So even though a plan is required for eligibility and grant funding, I think that there are opportunities here to strategically focus on the hazards and risks that your planning area faces to build in that resilience. The plan should not just be a checkbox for eligibility on a grant application. It should really be a process that is really holistically utilized with a lot of community input. Next slide, please. All right, so the planning process is going to inherently be slightly different for every jurisdiction because every jurisdiction is different. However, regardless of the type of plan, there are 4 really core steps in the planning process. So organize the planning process, your resources, your teams. Assess risks from natural hazards is step 2. Step 3, develop a strategy to reduce those risks. And then step 4, adopt and implement the plan. So that probably sounds pretty familiar to that 3-legged stool I showed you earlier, the know your risk, reduce your risk, insure your risk. It's a very similar way of identifying and identifying solutions to risk. So hazard mitigation planning is really not something that can happen in a silo with little preparation. This process, it should facilitate a process in your community and your jurisdiction to work together, identify the right stakeholders, and build teams and partnerships to guide resilience for sustainable risk reduction and development looking forward. Actions that are included in your community's mitigation strategy would address vulnerabilities identified in the risk assessment and should include really comprehensive range of mitigation options to things like structural mitigation projects and even non-structural activities. A type of non-structural activity that could be considered or things like developing codes and regulations. We talked about that yesterday. We heard about the 2021 I-code adoption that Guam is planning for. It could be activities like public education and outreach to ensure that everyone has visibility on this risk, and even natural resource protection strategies, which we also talked a bit about yesterday. Next slide, please. So all states and territories follow the planning processes as identified on that last slide. And here you can see some of the various plan elements that are required for inclusion in the plans. I'm not going to walk through every single one because you can see them on the screen here. But these will really help set the overall direction for mitigation planning within the jurisdiction and really looking robustly at risk as a whole. One item I really want to highlight here, it's in the second line. You'll see the element is called Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment, or HIRA. So you'll note that HIRA must account for what FEMA refers to as future conditions and changes to future risk of natural hazards. So future conditions must be included within your hazard mitigation plan. So this is a really broad category. It could include things like population change. It also could include things like climate change. And so it's essential to take that into consideration during the planning process. FEMA does not prescribe how a jurisdiction needs to account for future conditions. We only care that you do and justify really how you did that. So to make a connection from some of the presentations we saw yesterday, If partners like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have a data set or a study, for instance, the Coastal Atlas, that projects out potentially coastal erosion in the future and risks to that due to climate change, that type of information or data would be an extraordinarily valuable data set to provide to the planning team as they are taking on the plan update. So again, we don't really care how you incorporate that future risk, we just need you to do it. So it's really important, through events like this to identify what data sets, what studies are going on out there, and how we can get them into the hands of the hazard mitigation planning team. Next slide, please. Okay, so to transition slightly, I'd like to talk about a tool that the CNMI developed to aid in their planning efforts, the Smart Safe Growth Guidance Manual. Yes, next slide, please. So yesterday at the Assembly of Planners, we heard a lot of great presentations and discussion about topics about safe growth, smart growth, principles of good design, nature-based or green infrastructure development. And then we also heard about Guam's focus on sustainable development and some of the principles that are included and recommended by the UN. So all of these principles can be incorporated into or supported by your hazard mitigation plan. So here, after Typhoon Wu in 2015, FEMA and the EPA partnered with the CNMI, and an output was the Smart Safe Growth Strategy. So this strategy incorporated and discussed adaptation measures, made recommendations for government actions, and then focused on how to build local capacity through technical assistance and training to build their staff on building code processes, focused on potentially certification programs for inspectors. So it's a really broad document. The intent is to basically develop guiding principles to aid in planning and decision-making by leaders to align with this vision so that all development, including that of recovery, is more building a more resilient jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And so here you can see some of the guiding principles that were developed in the document. So I'd just like to highlight a few because they have aligned with some of the topics that we've been discussing over the last couple days. So climate change consideration is certainly a principle here, and including and considering the long-term impacts of climate change, sea level rise, coastal inundation on development, and incorporating that into all planning activities. You also see here critical facility location. So the intent is to then build new critical facilities outside of high-risk areas and then try to mitigate those that are currently more at risk. Additionally, we have green infrastructure. We've been talking a lot about green design and trying to be more sustainable, and so that is a principle that has also been incorporated into this guide. And another is early collaboration, and I'm highlighting this one because I liked this one. It's really about getting out and trying to be inclusive, bringing stakeholders to the table that maybe haven't traditionally been at the table, and helping them build, look at these principles, hear their voices, and incorporate them into the planning process. So these principles then can be linked to the CNMI hazard mitigation plan, both currently and during the future plan update process, to really help identify priority projects to address hazards that have been included in the risk assessment and that they have learned since the last update of the plan. Next slide, please. So turning now to Guam's hazard mitigation plan. So it was approved in 2019, expires in 2024, so we're smack in the middle of the approval process, and so this is a key time that I know that Guam and the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, Leo, are working on building that team and trying to get a lot of voices at the table. In the current version of the plan, there are three top hazards that were identified, typhoons, flooding, and seismic risk. And we're talking about risk and future conditions a bit ago. So Guam actually considered this element very well in the plan. And climate change-induced sea level rise is an overarching theme throughout. So that was a great addition there. So this document was put together by the team from across the territory, again, assessing risks and setting the direction for future development. And I know that Leo and team are working, I think they've already done a great job building a stakeholder network. If you're interested in providing input into the planning process, I haven't spoken with Leo about this, but I am sure he would be thrilled for additional input. Particularly if you have data, if you're aware of studies out there that would be important to consider in that future condition side of the house, I am sure Leo would welcome that support. Next slide, please. All right, so plan implementation. So once we have a plan, it's important to implement it. It is just as important as the planning process itself. As we see the severity, the intensity, and the frequency of disasters continue to increase, the urgency of our mission to reduce disaster suffering and incorporate mitigation actions has never been greater. So in this next part of the presentation, I'm going to speak to some key areas where I think we can begin to achieve some of our goals through implementing and maintaining the currency of our hazard mitigation plan. So a couple ways we can do that: continuing to engage with these key stakeholder groups throughout that 5-year planning cycle, actively seeking out funding resources, and building a pipeline of potential mitigation projects that can be developed as funding becomes available. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of it that's currently and more recently becoming available. And then pushing forward on some of the actions that were incorporated in the plan that aren't structural based, but more legislative or regulatory priorities that are in that plan, such as adopting and enforcing disaster resilient building code. Next slide, please. So we really encourage that the hazard mitigation plans are seen as living documents. Again, they're just a mechanism for a process. So simply finishing the plan, submitting to FEMA, putting it on the shelf is not the end. It's continuing to look at, to incorporate, to update. All plans have a maintenance process that are incorporated within them and basically detail how they're going to get from the plan approval to the next planning cycle and what the touch points are. And one of the most, I think, important maintenance activities is trying to ensure integration and alignment into other planning efforts, including documentation on climate change or comprehensive plan updates. So we did hear yesterday that Guam is working on updating their comprehensive plan for the first time, and I think it was at 50 years. This is an excellent opportunity to get involved and to ensure that integration and alignment is part of the planning process update. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can you get involved? Stakeholders provide such valuable input in developing and reviewing the plan, and broad involvement is critical. So again, I know that Leo and team are doing a great job in reaching out to stakeholders that have not participated in the past, and also re-engaging those that have participated in the past. So I think it's critical to try and get other voices to the table. I think that flooding is, and we talked about flooding a lot yesterday, I think that's really well incorporated into the plan. And I believe the planning team is really trying to get some data on non-flooding related hazards, the other hazards that are faced by Guam. So who has that data? Who could be an important voice to bring to the table? So, asking for your assistance and supporting the update and seeing what types of data sets and hazard identification and analyses that we can bring to the table. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so challenges to implementation. So the plan, again, provides a process, but it is not a silver bullet to resilience. There are a number of challenges to actually getting mitigation projects done, accomplished. Some of them can include really sustaining that momentum of the planning process after the plan is approved. Another challenge could be integrating other comprehensive planning efforts into the FEMA planning requirements. That could be simply because there's not visibility on what all of the planning efforts are underway. And so that's another reason it's so important to have a broad stakeholder base at the table. There are also challenges in getting that broad stakeholder base to begin with. If there's limited stakeholder involvement, there could be limited buy-in in the implementation of the plan. And then I think one of the key challenges that we hear so often is how do we identify and where are these funding resources coming from to actually implement that plan? So in the past year, FEMA has made a lot of additional funding. We have new programs and new resources that can help overcome this common hurdle of lack of funding to do the plan implementation. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a new program that I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard about, because I actually heard 2 other presentations yesterday bring it up, which is actually really exciting and helps me do my job, because the outreach and the enthusiasm for this program is out there. So the program is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program. And the intent of it is to support greater investments in mitigation, planning, and projects before a disaster occurs. This is a huge opportunity and supports proactive investment in community resilience. Before this program, the majority of mitigation funding available was only available after a disaster. So it was not available before a disaster to mitigate and prevent some of these damages. So the huge infusion of funding and support for this program changes that. It's really groundbreaking. With this, communities can plan and mitigate their risk to reduce that, the impact of a disaster. They'll have a quicker path to recovery and ideally experience less suffering as a result of the disaster. Next slide, please. All right, so some of the priorities here. So just real quick though, BRIC is funded by a 6% set aside from the Disaster Relief Fund in the previous year. So it's going to continuously accrue funds as disasters occur and as disaster estimates increase. That's a big change from other prior pre-disaster mitigation programs that were allocated annually through congressional allocations. This is a more consistent source of funding that we've seen for pre-disaster mitigation than in previous years. The intent is to encourage communities to consider making changes to infrastructure to reduce their damages, encourage these large-scale public infrastructure projects, increase the instances of projects that mitigate risk to 1 or more lifelines, and I'll talk about lifelines in just a minute, and also promotes projects that incorporate those nature-based solutions. So we talked about that a lot already. We saw that was a priority in the CNMI, Smart Safe Growth Plan. We've also heard a lot about some of these green strategies that folks are really trying to advocate for. And then another priority of the plan of this program is to incentivize the adoption and enforcement of modern building code. So you might be wondering a little bit about that lifeline, mitigating risk to lifeline bullet that I just mentioned. So in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what the lifeline concept is. Thank you. So to help communities better monitor disruptions to critical services and systems following a disaster and reduce the cascading impacts that can occur across government, business functions, FEMA and the response team launched this lifeline framework. So it really helps to highlight some of these priority areas and focus for initial incident stabilization. However, these are functions that exist in the steady state, and they enable really all aspects of society. So you can see some of what they include: safety and security, food, water, shelter, health and medical, energy, comms, transportation, and hazardous materials. So how does this relate to BRIC? Well, BRIC offers this really great opportunity for FEMA to apply these community lifelines concepts to hazard mitigation practices. Because that is one of the criteria that really is a focus of this BRIC program. So by leveraging lifelines in hazard mitigation planning and project information, it can be transformational in terms of a community's ability to respond and recover from an event. Next slide, please. Here's a quick example that I thought might be helpful to highlight sort of what this means and what it looks like from a project implementation perspective. So here you can see we have the American Samoa Department of Public Works. So in their hazard mitigation plan, they identified that there were risks from landslides and earthquakes that would threaten the island's transportation network. So to mitigate this risk that they have identified in their pre-disaster planning process, they identified that as a priority and received funding and actually implemented a rockfall mitigation project using FEMA mitigation funds. And that's going to protect critical access routes for residents in American Samoa. So some of the lifelines that's affecting are safety and security and transportation. So just wanted to sort of try and make that linkage in case the lifeline concept is a new one to you guys. All right, next slide, please. All right, eligibility. So for a project to be eligible, it has to be cost effective, needs to eliminate risk and damage from future hazards, meet the 2 latest consensus codes, which is quite important, align with the hazard mitigation plan, and then meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements as well. Next slide. Alrighty, so one of the guiding principles of the BRIC program is building state, local, territorial, and tribal capacity and capability. States and territories have the option to apply for funding in a couple of different categories, and this is one of those categories. And I'm going to focus on this one for a minute because it's a newer type of activity, and I think it's one that has a lot of potential. So these activities are those that enhance the knowledge, the skills, the expertise of the workforce that is on the ground implementing the projects and government services. And the intent is to improve or expand some of the skill sets that folks have to implement mitigation projects. So these can include things like building code activities, partnership activities, project scoping, and mitigation planning and planning related activities. So for building codes, funding can be used to evaluate the adoption or implement codes that reduce risk, enhancing existing adopted codes that include higher standards, and even developing the professional workforce capabilities through technical assistance and training. A couple of different partnership activities as well. Project scoping is quite important. It provides some engineering and feasibility study funding to build projects and help get those mitigation projects out there. Next slide, please. So planning activities. So these are eligible and could include preparing or updating a hazard mitigation plan. Could also include updating the plan to integrate the female lifeline concept or identifying specific projects that could be considered within those projects, and identifying a lot of infrastructure projects, etc. It also includes evaluating and updating and adopting and implementing land development codes and ordinances, again, with the goal of reducing risk. So there's a lot of good things there. Next slide, please. All right, and building code activities. So I know that Guam is already currently working on updating their building codes from the 2009 to the 2021, but this is another type of activity that can be used to enhance existing adopted codes and the enforcement to incorporate current requirements, higher standards, initiating things like electronic permitting, online model code access, virtual inspection technology. There's a lot in this, and I think it's really important to highlight. It also could include activities related to improving code enforcement, which again is another one that I think is quite important. Right, next slide, please. Alrighty, so one of the reasons that hazard mitigation is such a focus now is because of the increased costs of disasters, the increased risk to life and property associated with climate change. So additionally, studies are finding out that not only does hazard mitigation work, it also saves money. It saves money, it saves lives, it saves property. Natural hazard mitigation, as you can see on this slide, is found to have saved $6 on average for every $1 on federal mitigation grants, which is a study that was done according to the National Institute of Building Sciences. An earlier study in 2005 actually found that the benefit-cost ratio was 4-to-1, so this more recent study found that we are seeing an increase in the ability of mitigation to save money. Next slide, please. And additionally, there was another FEMA study just recently released several months ago called Building Code Saves. This estimates that losses avoided as a result of adopting hazard mitigation building codes is also substantial. And actually it finds that building code adoption and enforcement is possibly one of the most cost-effective ways to safeguard our communities against natural disasters. And not only are casualties reduced, the cost of building damage is also reduced following a natural disaster. Building codes really can be a silver bullet to helping communities get back on their feet faster by minimizing indirect costs such as business interruptions and lost income, and would ideally lessen or negate the need for post-disaster housing. And ideally, my goal is for us not to need another permanent housing construction project because we have mitigated a lot of the risk in some of our existing residential structures. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands recognized it was critical for them following the disaster to ensure that proper development and local infrastructure is built again in a safe manner. And so they actually adopted their building codes in 2018 they adopted the 2018 modern building codes. And then again, I'm excited to hear that Guam is also working on adopting modern code as well. Right, next slide, please. All right, so really developing plans, mitigating identified hazards, and promoting resilient and sustainable communities are not new tools or ideas, but we continue to find that they work. And from the last two slides, you see they save money. These are critical to saving lives and building resilient communities that will stay here for generations. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in events like this to come together and learn from each other new approaches and how to employ them, even if we're not necessarily using new tools in our toolbox. Just the collaboration and partnership are incredibly important. Just want to thank you for your time very much. And I think I'm turning it over to Colby. Colby?
Thank you. We had intended to have a Q&A session. I promise everyone will get time for lunch, but towards that goal, I'm going to suggest that if you do have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to ask them during lunch or during the rest of the day, as they will be around. With that, thank you all very much.
We're gonna begin with the virtual team that is still on in order to get their feedback on some of these sessions, and then we're going to move forward with what the rest of the group.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to have Heather Landeros do the first group, and Heather, you've been working in the community planning and capacity building recovery support function virtual group. Would you please share out at this time?
Yeah, hi, thank you everybody. So we had some great conversations on community planning and capacity building. One of the things that really stood out to me was the insight from everyone on the way we engage all members of our communities, both on short-term and long-term recovery needs. We discussed outreach strategies from using social media and communication apps like WhatsApp, to direct outreach from mayors and other community leaders, partnerships with key community organizations, businesses, congregations, and then with a big emphasis on those cultural and linguistic aspects to make sure that we really do reach everyone. And we talked about how critical these partnerships are to building community capacity to ensure really an equitable recovery, including things like wraparound services through NGOs like the Salvation Army, Food Pantry, faith-based organizations, also using workplace engagement strategies, ensuring citizens have access to essential documents, and then those key partnerships that we've had throughout the pandemic with community health and medical organizations, and really the importance of building those workforces back up. So thank you. Back over to you, Dirk.
And actually, I'm going to hand off to Darlene. Darlene, would you report out for us? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dirk. So we talked about the economic recovery, and what people were looking for was a robust and vital economy, a more diversified economy in Guam, and for those people who lost jobs, being able to retrain people for new jobs. Now, if we can make just one change in the economy, it would be to provide more help for small businesses. And this would be done through working with the local government officials and state and territorial officials, universities, and other organizations to assist these small businesses. Some of these organizations could include the Office of Planning and Development. And in Guam, the Guam Chamber of Commerce has been working with the governor to create an economic diversification task force. And the University of Guam and the Small Business Development Center have already provided great assistance for business startups. Now, I'm going to just summarize some of the successes and the challenges to economic recovery that people mentioned. For the successes, they mentioned the federal resources through the CARES Act. And they also said small loans to businesses and the payroll protection plan. They said the success was a different way of conducting business because, during the pandemic, you had to do that virtually. And so many were able to do that. So that was a success. Another person mentioned the development of mutual aid societies. These had existed in the past, but then they kind of disappeared for a while. But then during the pandemic, these came again. And so that was a success. Another thing mentioned was the emphasis on supporting local businesses. And also they said that the military sustained revenues into Guam and Hawaii because they spend money and they bring in revenues. Another thing was that businesses developed new, existing businesses developed new sections to supply PPE and masks and hand sanitizers. Now, of course, there were challenges to that too, because you needed to check and make sure that they were legitimate businesses and that the products were FDA approved and that they were readily available. So the challenges, just other general challenges to economic recovery included the reliance on the tourism industry, because it was such a big part of the economy that was devastated. Another challenge that's related is that it's a challenge to engage in other industries and to try to diversify the economy. Another is that there's a negative impact on businesses that rely on in-person clients, for example, cafes and so forth. Another challenge mentioned was that they were losing a lot of people who relocate for jobs elsewhere. This was mentioned in Hawaii that they lost 93,000 people because they found jobs elsewhere. Another challenge was the remoteness of the islands and the dependence on things being shipped in. And of course, there's the possibility of having shipping labor strikes too. And lastly, a challenge is the need for data in order to get federal grant assistance. So that's my summary. Thanks.
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you very much for your summaries. And the group that I was working with was the Health and Social Services Recovery Support Function. It was noted in our group that that there's a difference in terms of the cultures, and that Guam has one major asset thinking from a risk perspective, and that is Guam's population is extremely community-minded, not having quite the same individualism that has really confused vaccination efforts and masking efforts in the States. The National Guard has been extremely effective in Guam implementing mass vaccination efforts, and we've seen that also here, of course, in the States. And it's worth learning how those might be replicated in other public health actions, was a comment. Public health is extremely effective in doing home delivery of vaccinations for the elderly as well. The importance of reflections was brought forward, along with reflections on the change in culture over time, because when the polio vaccine first came out, Jonas Salk's vaccine, it took decades actually. We had polio with us for decades before a vaccine came out. And when it did come out, everybody got it without even questioning. It was really seen as a salvation from a devastating disease. We've had a different situation, and it's one we've had to deal with surprise to many of us to see the level of vaccine for the plan. we developed with COVID. And also procurement is working on public health aspects, including mobile clinics. This was brought forward. So yeah, there was a whole trend in our discussion how there are lessons learned from American Samoa had learned lessons as a collectivist society that had experienced a problem with measles, I believe it was, outbreak in 2018 and 2019. The mental framework in the population was already established prior to the current pandemic, so that the whole matter of protection was instantly employed, and once the vaccine rolled out, everybody is getting it. And it was pointed out that in the islands, it's always been about the collective good, and that what's good for me is really good for the family and good for all. The way of thinking about it differs, so it's an important lesson, not something easily passed on, but certainly the lesson, it's also that people will follow what is coming from the top, for better or for worse. In Guam, the governor was able to pass the Organic Act litigating quarantine powers, and it has worked. That might have been not so easily done elsewhere. There have been challenges, and the linkages between public health and community health were noted. One of the surprising things was how the pandemic has affected social structures and social services. And we need to be making that link seamlessly. This has been a challenge. The social side is collectively important, and the focus on the economy being so dependent on outside forces can serve as a stumbling block. It contributes to the public health as well, for people to have jobs and to be able to work effectively. Connectivity between all of it comes when it comes to health. Our engagement in the environment and what's good for the land, good for the trees. And what is the view from the fish's point of view? In any disaster, there are a lot of principles to learn, and it's been an opportunity for us to learn the principles of being engaged in this world. We had comments regarding addressing climate change and how recovery funding might be employed, because Climate Change and Resilience Commission had been convened before COVID, but COVID had its impact in concert with climate change. And the question came up as to whether new federal resources should be allocated towards climate change concerns. One of the comments that had come out in a previous conversation came from the top of the DPHSS, and that is that there are restrictions on funding that are sometimes difficult to manage, and that we need more flexibility on the funds and the application of those funds. There was a vision put forward at that time regarding using resources and making play space and internet connectivity and other kinds of things that bring about health. Using public health dollars to address climate change impact was further discussed, including things retrofitting schools for children that would protect against heat stroke, and also for the elderly in the same vein. Also, shifts in mental health and mental health care following climate change were pointed out. And the matter of vectors and the movement of vectors that are going to very definitely impact public health. The Zika virus was pointed out as a case in point, because it affects mental health and it affects physical health, and it's something that is changing in its location through mosquitoes that are now finding new places to breed. So it was said that it would be interesting to see how climate change solutions could provide economic opportunities in Guam. And I think we really saw how everything's really very well interconnected. Guam behavioral health and physical health and all of these things are connected, even down to coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion, the quality of the water that we drink. Everything seems to be very much connected. And so we have to be looking at all of these almost all at once in the same time. That's my report out from our groups. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dirk and Darlene and Heather, for helping to provide a virtual presence and space to allow more voices to jump on. Very much appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Lori. Do you want to volunteer first?
Thanks, Michelle. So I was the facilitator for the community planning and capacity building RSF, and we went through the whole World Cafe process. The activity in session 1 was we identified 3 of the top themes that we wanted to focus on in session 2. So we asked the group to focus on the what do we want to see, what was most important for recovery in this RSF, and in session 2, focusing on how to get there. And so the 3 areas that we identified was, it actually evolved. It went from, so for the first one, it went from being, it was building code enforcement, but then we kind of refined that and it turned into developing recovery, housing infrastructure plans, and a pathway for survivor and community access. And we had identified a bunch of people that should be involved with that planning, such as the Guam Recovery Office, the Guam Homeland Security and Civil Defense Office, AIA, Guam Society of Professional Engineers, Habitat for Humanity, FEMA, GURA, HUD, Public Works, and the Fire Department. And so an example of one of the things that we talked about in that, under that theme was identifying alternatives to transitioning survivors from, let's say, shelters to permanent homes. So finding alternatives to, instead of concrete structures, or maybe, like Robert had presented on the permanent housing program, what are other alternatives to concrete structures that are affordable but could also withstand strong weather events? And then the second theme that we listed was, it was another one that it started with strengthening the capacity and the capabilities of the Mayor's Council, and then we refined that to, excuse me, developing capacities within the villages via the mayors to plan for response and recovery operations from disasters, so that they are able to manage those efforts for their villages. And the biggest challenges that we identified for that was basically funding. And so we did say stuff like we should be able to find who we can partner with, partnering with like the private sector. For instance, we did say that there was some availability through existing organizations such as Serve Guam, and AmeriCorps to provide training following disasters for the mayors and the mayor's staff to build their capacity within their villages. And then the third thing that we said was an important theme or idea was to engage. We started with engaging the private sector in recovery planning, and then that turned into develop a disaster recovery task force made up of GovGuam agencies, nonprofits, and the private sector. And we said that it would be a good idea to identify what these partners can bring to the table that maybe we don't have existing already, like such as their expertise, for instance, in engineering or being able to provide training there so that we could build capacity in times of recovery. And that's what we came up with. Thank you.
Avade, everyone. So I helped facilitate the economic recovery support function, and I certainly don't think that I could do a better job than your own GovGuam recovery officer, Mr. David Cruz. I'll let him take it away.
You heard that term it's all about the economy, stupid, right? It really is about the economy here in Guam. Trying to bring the tourism back, getting people back to work, that's a big deal. And a major part of that is all the money that Michelle talked about, of course, did her funding pots. So that needs to be available, and we need to use that smartly. Folks, we talked about a lot of things in the economy. People probably need to retool themselves, get into something different, become carpenters, electricians, air conditioning mechanics. They need to have a backup plan. The community as a whole needs to do that too. And because the tourism business that depends on Asia is not going to bounce back right away. It's going to take some time. So we need to really diversify the economy to other areas. And they got that working group already that the governor set up. And that's work in progress. I know they talked about a lot of different things like aquaculture, manufacturing, bringing the pharmaceutical industry back to Guam. But again, we don't know how that's going to play out. That's going to be work in progress. IT, that's a biggie. We can become a big hub here on the island. They've been talking about that for a while. Broadband funding is available. A lot of things are outsourced to the Philippines and India. We can be what they call the cost center again here in Guam. We're at the crossroads here. And, the advantage here in Guam is, we're American territory. We've got stability here. Okay, unlike places like Hong Kong, they got, a lot of geopolitical issues going on. Let's attract some of the Hong Kong businesses to Guam and have them spend their money here and invest. We could do that. And I think that's one of the initiatives of the Economic Diversification Working Group is attracting some of those businesses from Hong Kong, maybe Singapore, over to Guam and tell them that, this is a very stable place to invest in.
I'm going to be really short and sweet. Our conversations were pretty dynamic. We really focused on the ambitious goal of restructuring public health. What that really meant was simplifying missions for the Department of Public Health and how public health really could separate itself perhaps from social services with their missions and approaches to serving their communities. Additionally, another hot topic was procurement of staff, and especially the critical urgency as the National Guard pulls out on September 15th, where and how medical staff will be found quickly and really move that process. Process was another area to just begin to simplify the processes that currently exist, beginning with baselines and analyses on where public health is at the moment and how you can continuously improve and develop and really begin to focus in on simplifying the problem. So that was another piece to this, was really identifying one problem and working on solutions with low-hanging fruit and technology. Along the lines of technology, data was definitely an issue that was brought up, specifically regarding database of the where and what people's needs are and how to be able to better identify that quickly. So that is another area where we wanted to centralize data and then decentralize some of the roles and responsibilities so that it's really clear what agencies have authority to do what, and so that that communication gets very clear and delineated as easily as possible. And with that, that is my quick summation of some of the key conversations that we had. And I just want to thank all of the facilitators, Brian Beck, Lori Rawls. I want to thank all of the online folks. And I just really want to thank also Colby and Edwin and everybody who came together today to really make this day a success. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Up next, the closing statements by Edwin Regis of the Guam Coastal Management Program and David Cruz from the Guam Recovery Office.
So I just want to say thank you, Colby and the Primo team for accepting the invitation to come to Guam. We are certainly very thrilled that it happened. It was a stressful process to do all the planning, considering everything. And there was a lot of things that were uncertain, but it really speaks to the spirit of Ohana and the testament that we will make it through. And so we're here, and I'm really pleased to provide some kind of overviews in terms of how we see this disaster recovery framework fit into the Bureau of Planning. I talked yesterday about the Bureau's role and broad coordination authorities, which really spans across all of government and private sector to align planning to be consistent with the Guam Comprehensive Development Plan. And I think that this structure, the National Disaster Framework, really provides an opportunity for us to understand our threats a little bit better and understand our vulnerabilities to hazards, but as well as understand the opportunities. And so what this really does is reaffirm our commitment to working with our state hazard mitigation officer and those planning structures so we can be better prepared to take advantage of and respond to and recover from disasters. So I'd like to end by just quoting my director, who's often says, Edwin, it's not enough to wish for something to happen, but you really have to do the hard work and the pathfinding to make your goals a reality. And I think that's what really this process is and this partnership will produce. So you have our commitment as a Bureau to ensure that we are bringing our full planning capabilities and capacity to achieve our missions where they align, and we certainly look forward to being a partner as we move this forward. So thank you very much. And at this time, I'd like to call up David Cruz to kind of provide some comments in terms of just how he sees the Recovery Office going forward. David. A round of applause for David again, please. Thank you.
And no, thank you. Really, the thanks should go to all of you that have taken the time to engage and just come to this conference, especially the FEMA folks. I mean, you guys are superb. You know, without your support, we would have never gotten to this stage right here, really. The funding, the technical expertise, that was just awesome. Well, what's next? I think I need to update the recovery plan. Now we got a little bit of life into it, so we can get into those different support plans now. Now we've got additional recovery support functions like community development and capacity building. And I think the LT, right? You heard him this morning. He wanted to incorporate cultural and natural resources. Yeah, we can do that. Next Monday and Tuesday, Michelle will lead a strategic planning session. And we hope to see a lot of you there so we can actually get down to, the nitty-gritty grind of rolling up our sleeves and writing these plans. So that needs to happen. Each of these RSF functions needs to have a plan that feeds into a larger plan, like Guam Comprehensive Plan. Okay, well, there are templates out there. I know I looked at the Oregon National Plan or Recovery Plan. That's a great plan. North Carolina has a good one. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have templates out there. So I'm looking forward to that the next Monday and Tuesday also. So thanks a lot for all your engagement, and I hope to see you all there next week. And again, have a safe trip if you're off island, and we hope to see you again next year. Thanks again.